Hello everyone. On behalf of the GATS tutoring program, I would like to invite all the students to make use of a new initiative, which is the AP tutoring video series. So what we've done in this is our qualified students have basically broken the AP subjects unit by unit into simple 10-minute videos. We hope that these videos will come in handy for your test prep or for the AP exam prep. The subjects that we have worked on so far are AP World, AP Biology, AP Human, AP Psychology, and AP Calc AB. So if you would like to watch more videos like this, please be sure to subscribe to our GATS YouTube channel. And also, if you would like to be part of this initiative, please email us at gats-tutoring@gatamilsangam.org. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to AP Psychology, Unit 5, Cognitive Psychology. This part of the exam contains around 13 to 17% of the exam, so let's get into it. So first of all, we need to learn about cognitive processes. These include all these different types of processing, so let's go into it. Effortful versus automatic processing. So effortful processing is when you take effort and try to memorize something, whereas automatic processing happens automatically without you even thinking about it. So a type of effortful processing would be if you are reciting words to remember them, or if you're trying to remember a grocery list by going through each one of them. Whereas automatic processing is you're doing that and you're doing something else and you're memorizing those words, or you're memorizing that grocery list without thinking about it at all. Deep versus shallow processing. So deep processing is when you think about put something through your head to the point where it becomes a part of your long-term memory, whereas shallow processing is when you only think about it surface level, so it's only staying in your short-term memory for around 30 seconds or so. Selective versus divided attention. So it's just what it means. Selective attention is when you put attention on one specific thing, whereas divided attention is where you can focus on multiple things at the same time. So watching a video and taking notes, you're able to do that. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So this is an interesting one. So it's when you think, right, and you're thinking in one way, and then you think about how you're thinking and say, oh, I would probably think like that. Let me do this the other way. That's metacognition. And it's a really high level skill that humans possess. Implicit versus explicit memory. Implicit memory is procedural memory. So memory that you remember, like cooking something, you remember each individual step, whereas explicit memory is like semantic and episodic memory. Semantic is when you remember words on a page or like information, and episodic memory is like when you remember a time in your life as an episode, kind of. Think of episodic like episode. Let's talk about memory encoding and storage. So there are three types of ways you can encode information: visual, acoustic, and semantic. Visual is obviously eye, so you remember something that you see. Acoustic is your ears, right? And visual memory is only there for 1 second, and that's also called iconic memory. Whereas echoic memory or acoustic memory, which is the ear, is there for 2 seconds. So for whatever reason, our ear is able to remember more memory for whatever reason. And then semantic encoding is when you remember information. And the serial positioning effect is very important in how we encode memories. We're usually we tend to remember things the first and last item in a list. So that's interesting. So obviously we have a sensory memory, right? But all of that sensory memory doesn't get converted into short-term memory. If I'm not paying attention to that, then it doesn't get converted. So say someone's talking in my ear and I don't pay attention, then it's not going to go into my short-term memory. Once I pay attention, my short-term memory, it goes into my short-term memory and it will stay there for 30 seconds unless it gets transferred into my long-term memory, where if I keep rehearsing it and I keep thinking about it, then it gets transferred into my long-term memory. The short-term memory can store around 7 plus or minus 2 things. So for some people, it can store 7, 8, 9. Very few people can store 10. Some people can also only store 6 or 5. So it's around 7 to 5 to 9 things, but usually 7 is the golden number. And then what we can do is we can transfer that memory into our long-term memory, which has an infinite duration and capacity as far as we know. We don't know the limit of the long-term memory's capacity and duration of how long memories can stay in there. We know we can forget stuff in our long-term memory, but we don't know the duration that it stays there. It could stay there forever. And if we want to bring something out from our long-term memory into our short-term memory to retrieve it, that's called retrieval, obviously. So let's talk about retrieval. There's 2 types of retrieval. There's recall and recognition. So recall is when you're forcibly thinking about, you have to just recall that, regurgitate that information without any prompting, whereas recognition is when you see that information and say, oh, I know what that is. So that's like multiple choice versus fill in the blank. Fill in the blank is recall, right? You have to actually know what you're doing. And then recognition is, can you see one of these 4 answer choices? Does it seem familiar to you? So there's obviously these retrieval strategies that you guys probably went over in class, but let's go over them really quickly. Mnemonic devices are things that essentially it's like an acronym of sorts. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally is something you probably learned in middle school or elementary school, depending on when you guys got taught PEMDAS. You probably learned this to remember the order of operations. Method of loci is kind of interesting. Essentially, you remember things based on the location that you did them. So for example, you could take a test or you could remember information while you're sitting in your desk and then be like, and then when test time comes, think about your desk and how you were remembering that information to retrieve that memory. So those are 2 types of retrieval strategies. There's a phenomenon called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, which essentially you know what it is. It's like there, but like you can't retrieve it. And that's a memory problem. And usually what happens is you remember it just fine, like an hour after, but because you were trying to forcibly remember it, for whatever reason, it doesn't work. And that's just a phenomenon that people have recognized. Priming is another way to remember stuff. It's memory by association. So it's a way you can get yourself ready to remember something. Say while I'm studying, I'm also eating a snack. And then when I eat a snack, the next day I remember whatever I was studying. That's priming. All right, there's 3 different types of memory as well. There's context dependent, state dependent, and mood congruent. So context dependent is kind of like the method of loci, where you're remembering stuff based on the location or the context that you took. So say I was studying and I was really sleepy. Well, that'd be state. Say I was just studying. Then whenever I'm taking a test and I feel like I'm studying, I would kind of get that memory back. State-dependent memory is kind of interesting. It's the state you're in. It's very similar to mood congruent, but let's say somebody's taken a type of drug, like alcohol or something, and they're in a state where they can't remember anything, like a blackout, but they do like a specific task, and then after they become like sober again, they remember that task perfectly. That is state-dependent memory. They forget that task. But then when you make them drunk again, they remember that task. That's state-dependent memory. They're only remembering that task while they're drunk, which is super interesting because that memory doesn't transfer over. A mood congruent memory is about the same thing, except it depends on your mood. So say you're really happy and you remember something, and then when you're sad, you don't remember it, but when you're happy again, you remember it. That's mood congruent memory. Now we have forgetting and memory distortion, right? So there's memory loss happens, and this is a curve that shows you how like fast memory loss happens. But if you rehearse stuff over and over again, you can actually decrease how fast memory loss happens. But memory loss will always happen. You have a couple ways to increase it. You can do rehearsal, just plain rehearsal, but that's not always going to work. So it's probably the worst way to do it. You can also, spend more time. And of course, if you spend more time learning something, you're obviously going to learn it better. You can do the spacing effect where essentially you learn something and then you learn a different thing. So say you do history and then you do math and then do history again. That space, for whatever reason, creates time for you to, and then when you do the history again, it strengthens it. So essentially, for whatever reason, it increases the time it takes to forget stuff. Overlearning is a way. So once you learn something, learn it over and over again. It's kind of like increased time spent. If you overlearn something, you're more likely to remember it. The testing effect is doing active recall. That is one of the best ways to increase memory. If you just try to recall test questions, or if you try to do test questions, you're more likely to remember the information. Interference. So you have proactive and retroactive interference, right? And remember it like this. Retroactive is when the new information blocks the old information, and proactive interference is when the old information blocks the new information. You also have types of amnesia. These are when amnesia is when you forget, like, you're in a traumatic accident or something like that, and you can't remember. Amnesia is just memory loss, but usually amnesia comes when you're struggling. You had like some accident or something like that. A retrograde amnesia is when you can't recall the past, but you can make new memories. Whereas anterograde amnesia is when you can't make new memories, but you can recall the past. Source amnesia is when you can't remember where you got information from, but you have that information. So that's another thing. That's something that happens to everybody. And then something important is the misinformation effect. This is not really a type of amnesia, but it is memory distortion, right? So the misinformation effect is when you use other information and then you're like, and you have the information, but then you use other information and come to a conclusion, and your brain thinks of that other information as true. So that's the misinformation effect there, and it causes a lot of bias and problems. Now let's talk about the biological basis of memory. And for this, you can look here. The ones I want to point out are the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala forms emotional memories, and the hippocampus is one of the most important in memories. It usually provides long-term and semantic and episodic memories. And then the basal ganglia is very important for procedural memories. The other one important term here is long-term potentiation, where neural pathways will often strengthen based on previous activities. So if you do an activity over and over again, the neural pathway that is related to that activity will actually grow and become stronger, which actually makes you more likely to remember that fact or that procedure or whatever you're learning. With thinking and problem solving, there are two ways to think, essentially, or problem solve: algorithms and heuristics. So algorithm is something like a computer would do. So if you tell it to add to 10 and go by ones, it will do that. It will go 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and it will go to 10. Is it fast? No. Heuristics is when you use reasoning and logical deductiveness to come to a conclusion, and it's not always right, but it's usually faster, and it's usually, it's way better than an algorithm for us because we're not computers. We're not that fast. Now there are some problems with the heuristics, which is availability heuristics and representativeness heuristics. When you use those, you're making incorrect assumptions. So availability heuristic is when you essentially you're making decisions based on what's available to you. So if you don't have all the information available, but you make a decision that's obviously not a good decision, but you make it because you think it's a good decision with the information available to you, you fall entrapped to the availability heuristic. And the representativeness heuristic is when you use, it's also the information available to you, but it's in a different way. So it's like think of it like this. Say I know a lot of my friends that are left-handed are doctors. This is a really dumb example, but people that are left-handed are doctors, and I see someone that's right-handed, I'm going to use my representation of a person being left-handed being a doctor to confirm that this person that's right-handed is probably not a doctor. Now you can see how this could go really wrong if somebody is using racial stereotypes to make their heuristics. So obviously that's a problem. Mental set is another way you can kind of confuse yourself. Mental set is when you are stuck to a one way of thinking and don't think of other options or alternatives. And this is obviously a problem because say that, for that one specific problem, your specific mental set doesn't work out. Well, you're stuck. You're not going to think of any other way. Intuition versus insight. Intuition is when you use your own logical reasoning to come to a conclusion. Insight is when you get a sudden realization on a particular thing, and you come to a conclusion that way. Inductive versus deductive reasoning, you can look at the chart over here, but deductive reasoning is when you take the information and come to a theory, whereas inductive reasoning is when you have a theory in mind and then you use your information available to come to confirm that theory. Convergent versus divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is when you're thinking of only one way to solve something, and it's great for IQ tests, but it's not great for like in general thinking and problem solving. Whereas divergent thinking is where you think of multiple ways to approach a problem, and this is great for problem solving. The Flynn effect is an interesting phenomenon where the average IQ of the population, like everywhere, is increasing year on year. Now, obviously, the IQ test is standardized, which means that every single year, you can only have the average IQ is 100, but they basically they're looking at how many questions people are getting right over year to year, and the average IQ is actually increasing, probably due to better schooling, but we don't actually know the exact reason. And then we have fluid versus crystallized intelligence. So young people tend to have fluid intelligence where they can think and manipulate their mind and, think about things different ways. Whereas old people tend to have crystallized intelligence, which is like hard facts and knowledge. And that's how their intelligence is usually. As you grow older, you gain more crystallized intelligence because you know more facts and information about the world, but you lose your ability to be fluid and think about the world in creative ways. There are also other errors in problem solving. One is functional fixedness, which is essentially when you only think of an item as having one use. So let's say I have a hammer and I only use that hammer to hit nails in, and I need to remove a nail. Well, there is a back part of the hammer that can remove the nail, but I say, oh, this hammer can only hit the nails in. I can't use it to remove the nails. Oh no, what am I going to do? That's functional fixedness. There's also a lot of biases, and we can go through them all because some of them we won't go through all of them, but we'll go through the ones that I think are important. So confirmation bias, I would definitely go through all of them though. Confirmation bias is this is the most important one, and this is when you essentially take something and you believe that all pandas are lazy. I'm not gonna use like a human example. And then you see a panda being lazy, then you'd be like, okay, that confirms my belief, even though maybe not all pandas are lazy. Because you saw a panda being lazy and you already believed that a panda was lazy, you confirmed your beliefs. The halo effect is when you essentially believe that someone is really good and would not do anything bad. So say your friend committed a crime and you're like, my friend would never do that. That's the halo effect. You're biased against your friend, but not everybody's going to be like that. Self-serving bias is important because it's essentially when you manipulate the situation to serve yourself. So say you get a good grade on the test, it's not the teacher's fault, it's your fault. You worked for that grade. But if you get a bad grade, then that's all the teacher's fault. That's not because you didn't work hard on it. That's not because you didn't work hard. That's because the teacher failed to teach you the material, obviously. Actor observer bias is pretty interesting. It's essentially when you, as an observer, you tend to attribute a person's problems but on their own character, whereas when you do something wrong, you attribute it to circumstances outside. So say you litter, say someone else littered, you're like, oh, that person's a terrible person. But say you litter and you're like, oh, there was no trash can in sight, what am I supposed to do? That's actor observer bias. And then hindsight bias is when you're essentially like, if you're in a situation and you fail to predict the outcome, after that outcome occurs, you're like, oh, I should have seen that coming. And that's hindsight bias. You're like, when you think something is when you think of the solution after the solution occurs, or you think of the prediction after the actual thing occurs, and you're like, oh, I should have seen that. I would have seen that, even though you definitely would have not. And it happens so many times. The framing effect is when you essentially you get biased based on how somebody approaches a question to you. So in a lot of surveys, in a lot of political surveys, and I'm not going to go into that, but they will not give you an option no. They'll give you yes, or I'm not a very good person or something like that to make you feel bad. And that's how the question was framed to you. So you would pick yes. I'm not going to go into like specifically what question, but like they really that's how they frame it to you, and that's why you pick a choice that you did. Now there's different types of intelligences. So there's four main types of theories of intelligence. One is Spearman's general intelligence, which essentially says there is a G factor or general intelligence that can be reliably measured. Thurstone's primary mental abilities theory says there's 7 different types of intelligence, and a single G score is not informative enough. Gardner's multiple intelligences theory essentially says that there's 8 different types of intelligences, and there's a lot of other skills than just verbal and mathematical skills. And Sternberg's triarchic theory is intelligence is best classified into 3 different areas, and these areas can be easily measured: analytical, creative, and practical. Analytical intelligence is thinking. Creative intelligence is how able are you to create new things, and there are ways you can test that. And practical intelligence is how well you do practically, like manipulating objects and things like that. So intelligence testing. When testing for intelligence, tests should be standardized, reliable, and valid. Standardized essentially means every single person that takes this should get the score that they deserve. Reliable means that the score it predicts is the same every time, and valid doesn't measure what it's supposed to be measuring. If I'm taking a test about math and it measures my English skill, then it's obviously not measuring what it's supposed to measure. Types of tests. There's achievement tests, which essentially teach you what you've already or test you on what you've already learned, and aptitude tests, which aim to measure what skills you have. So the SAT is an aptitude test. It tests what skills do you have, how much math, how much English do you know. The stereotype threat is people sometimes perform worse since they're stereotyped. So if a person is stereotyped to behave a certain way, then they might perform that way, and that leads to incorrect test sampling, or it leads to incorrect test results. So sometimes that can hurt standardized tests because they're not measuring accurately because people are stereotyped. Now let's talk about language acquisition and production. So some of the important things with language acquisition is Broca's and Wernicke's area, which controls speech production and speech recognition respectively. Now, critical periods are really important. This is something that Noam Chomsky discovered, and he essentially said that there are critical periods in our lives, like when we're very young, that we're meant to learn things, and if we miss those critical periods, then it's going to be really hard to catch up. And there's actually this person that didn't have access to the outside world for 13 years, and she's now struggling to speak because she didn't hit her critical period. So she didn't learn to speak when she had had the critical period. So it's really hard to learn after that critical period. Overgeneralization is the tendency of little children to overgeneralize grammar rules. So, for example, a little child might tell you, they don't tell you, I went to the park. They'll tell you, I go to the park. And that's obviously wrong, but that's overgeneralization there. The linguistic relativity hypothesis is essentially language controls the way we'll perceive the world. So some languages are really slow and smooth and soft flowing. Those people tend to be more smooth and soft flowing. Some languages are really sharp and fast. That changes how we perceive the world. There's a Aboriginal language that only in Australia that only does absolute direction, not relative direction. They only have a north, south, east, and west. They don't have a left, right, up and down. So they probably have an up and down, but they don't have a left and right. So they talk about everything in absolute direction, and because of their language, they're able to have basically an internal compass. They know when something is north and something is south. So language really does change the way we perceive the world. So there's certain stages in language production, right? So in the very first stage, when you're really young, when a baby's really young, they'll babble speech sounds, and they'll resemble language, but they're not perfect. And then month 10, they're trying to resemble language, right? Month 12, they can do 1 or 2 words. They can say mom, dad, and stuff like that. By 24 months, they learn 2-word speech, which is essentially they can say one noun and one verb. Like they could say mom, milk, or something, mom, go, or like, dad, here, or something like that. They can say that, but they can't say anything past that. And then after 24 months, then speech develops rapidly into complete sentences. So that's what the critical periods are. 24 months is probably a critical period where that speech kind of develops really, really quickly. So if you miss that critical period, it's going to be really hard to learn and catch up. All right, that is Unit 5 of AP Psychology, Cognitive Psychology. I'll see you next time for Unit 6, Developmental Psychology.